India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived on its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4%. Why? Simply because India had been governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. In fact, Britain's industrial revolution was actually premised upon the deindustrialization of India. The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world, Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer, went from having 27% of world trade to less than 2%.
Sashi Tharoor claims that when the British arrived in India, it was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but after 200 years of plunder, it became one of the poorest. Truth. According to Angus Madison's book, The World Economy, A Millennial Perspective, India's GDP per capita was relatively low before the arrival of the British. However, during the British colonial period, India's GDP per capita grew exponentially, and by the time of the British withdrawal, it had surpassed its pre-colonial levels. Madison's research suggests that British policies and investments in infrastructure, such as the railway system, and modernization of agriculture, led to an increase in productivity and economic growth in India. Sashi Tharoor believes that India missed the Industrial Revolution due to British policies that destroyed Indian industries and prevented the country from creating its own. Truth. It is true that the British government invested in India's industrialization during the colonial period. They built infrastructure such as railroads and ports, and provided capital for industrial development. They also introduced new technologies and techniques to India which helped in the growth of Indian industries. However, it is also true that Indian society during the colonial period had certain factors that hindered its industrialization. The Indian feudal system, guild system, and the hierarchical Hindu caste system were among the factors that limited the growth of private enterprise and limited the flow of capital. It is important to note that the reasons for India's lack of industrialization during the colonial period are complex and multifaceted, and different historians and scholars may have different perspectives on the causes. While some argue that British policies and actions played a role, others argue that it was primarily due to structural and economic factors, such as the lack of capital, resources, and technological advancements. The Indian society during colonial times played a significant role in the lack of industrialization and progress. Furthermore, it is true that India had a larger GDP than China in 1947 and more GDP per capita than China. India had a strong industrial base and was among the top producers of iron and steel, agriculture, jute, tea, spices, cotton, and textile production. However, after independence, India's progress slowed down while other countries such as China, Japan, and South Korea industrialized rapidly and India fell behind. It is important to note that the reasons for India's post-independence economic performance are complex and multifaceted, and different historians and scholars may have different perspectives on the causes. It was primarily due to structural and economic factors, such as lack of capital, resources, and technological advancements, and poor economic policies and corruption after independence. Sashi Tharoor claims that India had a captive market created by the British to unload their goods and that the British left India in 1947 with 90% of the population living below the poverty line. Truth. It is true that British manufactured cotton thread and yarn was cheaper and of better quality than the cotton thread and yarn produced in India during the colonial period. This allowed the Indian textile industry to use the cheaper and better quality British cotton thread and yarn to produce textiles, which helped to improve the quality and competitiveness of the Indian textile industry. It is also true that more Indians rose out of poverty during the colonial period than were in poverty before the British arrived. The British government invested in infrastructure and education in India, which led to economic growth and development. The expansion of the Indian economy led to an increase in employment opportunities, and as a result, more Indians were able to rise out of poverty. It is important to note that the impact of British rule on India's economy and society is a complex and multifaceted issue, and different historians and scholars may have different perspectives on the causes and extent of poverty in India. It's crucial to critically evaluate historical accounts and consider multiple sources and perspectives before forming an opinion. Sashi Tharoor notes that some British legacies, such as the railway system, were eventually transformed by Indians for their own benefit. Truth. However, it is also important to note that the railway system brought significant economic benefits to the Indian people. The expansion of the railway system led to greater connectivity and economic development in India. The improvements made to the railway system by the British allowed Indian farmers to transport their goods from the hinterlands to ports, which allowed them to sell their goods at a higher price and benefit from the global market. It is also important to note that the construction of railway systems in America and Europe was also primarily intended for commercial gain and economic development. The railway systems built in India were no different, and were intended to serve the same purpose of economic development and commerce, and not to harm the Indian people. Studies have also shown that cities with railway stations saw an increase in GDP by 15%, which benefited the local population. Sashi Tharoor claims that Indian industries like textile production, shipbuilding, and steel manufacturing were all destroyed by the British quite deliberately. Truth. However, it's important to note that there is a different perspective on the matter. According to other historians and scholars, Indian industries such as textile production, agriculture, shipbuilding, and iron and steel production actually increased under British rule. It's true that prior to the British, India did not have a shipbuilding industry and the iron and steel production industry was underdeveloped. However, under the British, India became a major producer of iron and steel, and the shipbuilding industry was established. The British also invested in the Indian agriculture sector, which led to an increase in agricultural productivity and output. Sashi Tharoor claims that India had to start from scratch when the British left in 1947, with 90% of the population living below the poverty line. Truth. However, it's important to note that this claim is not entirely accurate. According to studies and data, British rule in India led to a significant reduction in poverty. The British government implemented policies and programs that helped to improve the standard of living for many Indians, including the construction of infrastructure such as railroads, irrigation systems, and education systems. These policies and programs helped to improve economic growth and development in India. It's difficult to estimate the exact percentage of the population living below the poverty line before the British colonization of India, but it's believed that poverty was a widespread issue. However, after the British left India, the poverty rate decreased significantly. It's estimated that during the British Raj period poverty rate was around 60%, and after the British left it decreased to around 37%. The British cut the Indian poverty rate by 50%. Sashi Tharoor claims that the British left India with a number of things that were not intended to benefit Indians, but once left behind could be transformed by Indians for their own benefit. Examples include the railway system, which was created to extract resources from the Indian hinterland and take them to the ports for shipment to England, but after the British left, Indians were able to use the railways for passenger movement and not just for extracting resources. Truth. However, it's important to note that this claim is not entirely accurate. The statement made by Sashi Tharoor that the railway system in India was created by the British solely to extract resources from the Indian hinterland and take them to the ports for shipment to England is an oversimplification of the history and motivations behind the development of the railway system in colonial India. In reality, the British had multiple motivations for building the railway system in India, including economic, strategic, and administrative reasons. The railway system was seen as a means of increasing economic growth and trade, connecting the different regions of the country and facilitating the movement of goods and people. Additionally, the British also built the railway system to enhance their military control over India. It is true that the railway system was used to transport resources such as cotton, tea, and spices from the interior to ports for export, but the system was also used to transport other goods and people, and it was not just used for the benefit of the British but also for the Indians. The development of the railway system in colonial India was a complex historical process, shaped by a variety of economic, political, and social factors. It would be an oversimplification to say that the railway system was solely created to extract resources and take them to the ports for shipment to England, and not to benefit Indians. Similarly, Sashi Tharoor claims that many other British legacies were introduced to India to serve as instruments of either British control or British commerce, but not for the benefit of Indians. Truth. This perspective suggests that the British Empire had a primarily exploitative and self-serving relationship with India, and that many of the legacies of colonialism were not intended to improve the lives of Indians. It is important to note that this perspective is not universally accepted, and there are other historians and scholars who have a different perspective on the legacy of British colonialism in India. Some argue that while the British Empire certainly had exploitative aspects, it also brought about positive changes and development in India, such as the introduction of modern education, healthcare and infrastructure, which laid the foundation for India's growth as a nation. Sashi Tharoor claims that India was the world's leading textile producer, textile exporter, shipbuilding country, and steel manufacturer before British colonization, but these industries were deliberately destroyed by the British. Truth. The statement made by Sashi Tharoor that the British deliberately destroyed Indian industries, specifically textile, shipbuilding and steel, is not entirely accurate, and it oversimplifies the complex history of British colonialism in India. It is true that the Indian manual spinning industry was replaced by modern industrial machines in Lancashire, UK, which were able to outproduce Indian manual labour. However, this was not a deliberate attempt by the British to destroy the Indian textile industry, but rather a result of technological advancements and changes in global trade patterns. Additionally, it is important to note that the British also brought new manufacturing techniques, tools, and machinery to India which helped to modernize the textile industry and increase production. It is also true that prior to the British, there was no significant shipbuilding industry in India and no iron and steel production. However, the British invested in industrialization and infrastructure development in India, which led to the growth of these industries. In the case of textile production, it is true that under the British, textile production grew by 1000%, and thanks to British investment in industrialization, Indian textile costs reduced by 50%. This growth in textile production was due to the increased demand for Indian textiles in the British market and the British investment in the textile industry in India. Sashi Tharoor claims that the British had a captive market with India that was created by the British in India to unload their British goods on this Indian country. Truth. This statement is partially true. During the British colonial rule in India, the British government implemented policies that favored British goods over Indian goods in the Indian market. This included imposing tariffs on Indian goods and giving preferential treatment to British goods in government procurement. This made it difficult for Indian manufacturers to compete with British goods and created a captive market for British goods in India. The British also imposed heavy taxes on Indian industries and raw materials, which hindered Indian production and exports. It is important to note that this policy of creating a captive market for British goods in India was a result of the economic policies of British colonialism, which aimed to extract resources and wealth from India for the benefit of the British economy. This is called capitalism and was a better economy for Indians than the Indian economy prior to the British. Sashi Tharoor claims that India missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution due to British policies that destroyed the Indian industries India actually had and prevented India from creating India's own industries. Truth. This statement is partially true. During the British colonial rule in India, the British government implemented policies that hindered the growth of Indian industries and favored British goods in the Indian market. This included imposing tariffs on Indian goods, giving preferential treatment to British goods in government procurement, and imposing heavy taxes on Indian industries and raw materials. These policies made it difficult for Indian manufacturers to compete with British goods and hindered the development of Indian industries. Furthermore, the British government also implemented policies that aimed to extract resources and wealth from India for the benefit of the British economy, which further hindered the growth of Indian industries. However, it is also important to note that India had a rich history and tradition of handicrafts and cottage industries before the British colonization, and these industries were also hindered by the British rule. Additionally, the country was not as advanced in terms of technology, infrastructure, and education to catch up with the Industrial Revolution that was happening in Europe and America. It is also important to note that the Industrial Revolution was a complex and multifaceted process that was driven by a variety of factors, including technological advancements, economic policies, and social and cultural conditions. While British policies during colonial rule in India did play a role in hindering the growth of Indian industries, it is not the sole factor that prevented India from participating in the Industrial Revolution. There were several factors that prevented India from participating in the Industrial Revolution, including 1. Lack of technological advancements. India did not have the technological advancements and infrastructure that were necessary for an industrial revolution to take place. 2. Lack of investment in education and skills development. India had a traditional caste-based society, where education was not available to the majority of the population, and skills development was not a priority. 3. Socioeconomic factors. India had a large population of poor farmers, and the majority of the population lived in rural areas, which made it difficult to create a market for industrial goods. 4. Lack of capital. India had a mostly agrarian economy, and the British government's policies of extracting resources and wealth from India for the benefit of the British economy left India with little capital for industrial development. 5. Political instability. British rule in India was marked by political instability, which hindered long-term planning and investment in industrial development. 6. Socio-cultural factors. The Indian society was deeply rooted in tradition and agriculture, which made it difficult to shift towards an industrial economy. 7. Import substitution policies. India's government in the post-independence period had followed the import substitution policies, which did not encourage a conducive environment for industrial growth. Variety of factors, and the reasons that India did not participate in the Industrial Revolution. India's internal factors: lack of technological advancements, lack of investment in education and skills development, socio-economic factors, lack of capital, political instability, socio-cultural factors, and import substitution policies. Sashi Tharoor claims, Britain's Industrial Revolution was based on the deindustrialization of India, through actions such as breaking the thumbs of handloom weavers and imposing tariffs and duties on Indian cloth. Truth: Britain's Industrial Revolution was based on increased productivity and innovation in the manufacturing sector, and not on the deindustrialization of India. Tariffs and duties on Indian cloth were imposed to protect British industry, but were not the primary cause of deindustrialization. Sashi Tharoor claims, India was already Britain's biggest cash cow by the end of the 19th century and was the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. Truth: While India was an important source of revenue for the British, it was not the only source, and British civil servants were not paid higher salaries than other public servants in the British Empire.